Welcome to Talk 28 in our series where I'm reflecting on God's goodness to me throughout my life. Looking back on it, I suppose I travelled fairly widely during the time we were at Mattersey. Apart from the many places in Europe we visited, I found myself on the Lord's business in America, Africa and Asia, though never, incidentally, in Australia. These visits, which cover the period from 1982 to 2004, were either in connection with the Pentecostal World Conference, which later became the Pentecostal World Fellowship, or preaching trips. My reason for attending the Pentecostal World Conference in Oslo in 1992 was that because it was being held in Europe, the PEF presidium had decided to hold a committee meeting there at the same time. Eileen and I had visited Norway for the first time 2 years previously, where we had enjoyed a holiday there before attending the EPTA conference in Lillehammer. This time, however, I was alone. During one of the mornings, I was sitting high up at the back of the auditorium and was surprised to hear my name mentioned at the close of the session. Dr. A. Hughes was asking me to see him on the platform during the coffee break. I couldn't imagine why, but of course went to see him as requested. This was not quite as easy as it sounds, because to get there I had to make my way through hundreds of people who were exiting the venue and all walking in the opposite direction from me. When I finally got there, he said to me, "Oh, David, as you know, you've been appointed to the advisory committee and we'd like you to sit on the platform with us for the rest of the conference." Well, I knew nothing about this appointment. It was a complete surprise. And when a year or so later I was elected to the presidium, it was an even greater surprise and honour. In 1995, the conference was particularly special because it was held in Jerusalem. And at this time, Eileen came with me. We'd never been in Israel before, and we made sure that we saw as many of the biblical sites as possible. We had booked a tour with a Christian company and travelled in a small coach with a group of Brits who were attending the conference, and it was there that we met Ivor and Jan Madison, who were pastoring the church in Ollerton, not far from Mattersey. We got to know Jan very well when she came to live in Brixham after Ivor had died. The tour involved a visit to Tiberias on the shore of Lake Galilee, from where we visited Capernaum, took a trip across the lake in a boat like those used by Jesus' disciples and from which he calmed the storm, and had a meal on the lake shore eating St. Peter's fish, so called because of the occasion where he found a coin in the fish's mouth. We went to Caesarea Philippi, a beautiful place, where Peter confessed Jesus as the Christ. We visited the place in the River Jordan where Jesus is believed to have been baptized, and further south we had a brief stop in Jericho. We travelled up from there to Jerusalem in time for the conference, and of course visited Bethlehem and all the places you would expect, many of which have been spoilt by centuries of tradition and tourism. Eileen got to see Nazareth, but I missed the trip because I had to be in a presidium meeting. Highlights in Jerusalem were the Garden of Gethsemane and the Via Dolorosa. But without a doubt, the visit to the Garden Tomb was by far the most moving. It may or may not have been the actual site of Jesus' burial and resurrection, although I like to think that it was, but it was certainly a powerful reminder of the truth. Jesus is not here. He is risen. And who could forget the visit to the upper room and joining with other Pentecostals in speaking in tongues as the first disciples did in Acts chapter 2. After the conference, we visited Masada, floated on the Dead Sea where it's impossible to sink, and went to the cave where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. It was there, I think, that we paid an Arab to let us take a photo of his camel. We also visited a museum where we saw a number of ancient seals, some dating back over 3,000 years, years and reminding us of Paul's teaching that after we believed, we were sealed with the Holy Spirit of promise. So, during the trip, there was much to remind us of Bible times and the truth of God's Word. We were glad that we went, but have never had a wish to return. Eileen is now enjoying the heavenly Jerusalem, and one day I will join her there, and all because of Jesus. In 1998, the conference was held in Seoul, Korea, at the vast Yoido Full Gospel Church, led by David Yonggi Cho, numbering at the time some 720,000 members. We had at first thought to extend the trip and visit China and the Great Wall. Eileen had always had a great interest in China, but when it turned out that the visit was not feasible, she decided not to accompany me. I had met Cho at the London World Conference in 1976 when I gave him a copy of my book, Know the Truth, later to be renamed You'd Better Believe It. I was naturally interested to visit his church and to experience one of the Sunday services there. There were, I think, 6 services each Sunday to accommodate the vast numbers. Everything had to be organised and left little, if any, room for the exercise of spiritual gifts like tongues, interpretation and prophecy, which we might expect in a smaller congregation. Presumably, and hopefully, there was opportunity for such gifts to be experienced in their many home groups. The final meeting of the conference was held in the Olympic Stadium, where it was estimated that over 100,000 people were in attendance. I was privileged to read from the scriptures, which I found a little difficult on this occasion, as I had somehow mislaid my glasses on a visit to the prayer mountain, and was using a pair borrowed from an English brother who was staying at the same hotel as me. During the conference, it was decided to hold the next presidium meeting in Hawaii in 1999. The reasoning seemed to be that as Hawaii is in the Pacific Ocean, it was not too far from either Asia or America. However, no one considered the inconvenience for anyone travelling from Europe. But as I was the only European on the presidium, I could hardly object. So that is how I came to fly to Hawaii, a 24-hour journey each way for a 3-day committee meeting. The purpose was to plan for the 2001 conference, which was to be held in Los Angeles. Fortunately, the meeting finished a day early, and I had a day spare before flying home. This gave me the opportunity to take a minibus tour of the island, visiting, among other things, Pearl Harbor and a tropical rainforest. I also experienced macadamia nuts for the first time and learned that the name comes from a Scot named Macadam, who first discovered them and who also invented tarmac. Eileen was able to travel with me for the Los Angeles conference in 2001, and in the week before the conference we both enjoyed a short holiday staying with Brian and Anne Lee, old friends from Retford, who had emigrated to Laverne, just a few miles from LA. It was good to renew fellowship with them and to preach in their local AOG church. At the conference itself, I'd been asked to chair a theological seminar at which Roger Stronstad, a Canadian scholar whose writings I greatly admired, was to be one of the speakers. The subject was the baptism in the Holy Spirit, and at the last minute I was asked to be the other speaker, deputising for an American brother who was unable to attend. I was so grateful to the Lord for the opportunity he gave me to speak at the conference, and the help he gave me to do so at such short notice. The last World Conference we attended was in South Africa in 2004. This conference was in many ways different from all the others. In the opening meeting, the delegates were warmly welcomed by the President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, who had been Deputy President under Nelson Mandela from 1994 to 1999 and served as President from 1999 to 2008. Eileen felt particularly honoured as she was seated right next to him on the front row. But much more important was the fact that so many participants were from African countries, and the meetings were marked by the freedom of expression so typical of African worship and so different from the formalism we have seen elsewhere, even in some Pentecostal meetings. It was something we were to see much more of in later visits to Africa in the years that followed my retirement from Mattersey. After the conference, we hired a car and travelled to Africa School of Missions, founded by Paul Alexander, my newly appointed successor at Mattersey. We broke our journey at Witbank, where I preached at 2 services on the Sunday, travelling on to ASM on the Monday, where we were warmly welcomed by the staff. They asked us if we were planning to visit the Kruger National Park. And when we said no, one of them kindly phoned a relative who worked there and arranged for us to stay for a few nights at Skukuza, one of the safari lodges in the park. Our accommodation was in an extremely comfortable one-room apartment that looked something like a traditional African hut with a thatched roof. The restaurant served excellent food, which was relatively inexpensive, and offered views overlooking the wonderful wildlife. We enjoyed every moment we spent at Skukuza, especially when a company of mongooses ran across the compound in single file right in front of us. But of course, it was driving outside the safari park that we saw most of the wildlife. It was early spring in the southern hemisphere, and the leaves had only just begun to appear on the trees and bushes, making it easy to spot animals and birds that happened to be in the area. We travelled miles each day, taking care to obey the instruction never to get out of the car except in specially designated safe places. We were also glad that the car had good air conditioning, because it was often important to ensure the windows were closed. On one occasion, we stopped to watch a group of baboons in the road just ahead of us, and I closed the electric windows. However, I'd momentarily forgotten that, unlike our car at home, our hire car had electric windows only at the front. We only realised the back ones were still open when a large baboon leapt in onto the back seat, attempting to steal our lunch. I turned round and shouted in a loud voice, "Ooh!" Eileen later told the grandchildren that Grandad roared like a lion, and, thank God, the animal obeyed. Both we and our lunch were safe. After that, we never opened the back windows again for the rest of the trip. Apart from that, the remainder of our stay there was relatively uneventful. We loved it so much that when I was back at ASM a few years later, I borrowed a car and went back there. Our visit was far too short, but was the highlight of our trip to South Africa. We were particularly grateful that in such a short time we'd managed to see the big 5: lion, leopard, elephant, rhino and buffalo. A wonderful ending to our last Pentecostal World Conference. But of course my travels beyond Europe were not limited to my role in the Pentecostal World Fellowship. There were preaching trips as well. At first, these centred on the USA, where I combined preaching with raising funds for our building project at Mattersey. An American AOG pastor named Paul Curtis had a burden for Britain, came to see me on one of his trips to England, and said he would like to help raise funds for our new hall of residence. So, at Paul's invitation, in February 1982, I spent 10 days preaching in AOG churches in North Carolina with a view to returning in mid-May for a period of 4 weeks. I enjoyed the trip in February, and the Lord blessed my ministry, and about £1,400 was raised towards our building fund. However, the trip in May-June would be more fruitful in that respect. I was looking forward to it, and had bought my flights in advance as that was more economical. But only a few weeks before the trip, Paul contacted me to apologise and tell me that he'd been unable to arrange a suitable itinerary for me and that he felt that the time was not right. But I had already bought non-refundable tickets for flights both ways. And I'd already planned the timetable at Mattersey to enable me to be away from the college throughout that period. After praying about it, I contacted John and Sarah Miles, who were by then living in Naperville, Illinois, and asked their advice. Sarah suggested that I was in a situation like Abraham's, when he set off not knowing where the Lord would lead him. So I used the air tickets to fly as far as New York and paid the extra to fly on to Chicago, where John and Sarah collected me from O'Hare Airport on May the 18th. When I arrived, they told me that they had contacted Richard Dortch, the superintendent of the Illinois AOG, and that he was arranging itinerary for me around Illinois, where I was already known through my 3 visits back in the 70s. I stayed with John and Sarah until the 6th of July, preaching in churches in the Chicago area on Sundays and Wednesday evenings. These included Yorkville, Palatine, DeKalb, Naperville and Lake Villa, as well as Chicago itself. I also spent a day at Wheaton College, had lunch with John, who was now a French professor there, and with Peter Kuzmich from Yugoslavia, and saw the wardrobe made famous in C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. On Thursday the 27th, I flew via Denver to San Jose, California, to visit Bethany Bible College. Dick Foth had been the pastor in Urbana, where I first preached on my visit to the States in 1972, was now the president of Bethany, and I had a couple of useful days with him visiting the college and comparing notes. I had an interesting experience flying back on the Saturday. The weather was extremely hot and everyone else was dressed in shorts and t-shirts. I, however, was still wearing my jacket. As I was waiting in the queue to check in, an airline official approached me and said, "Excuse me, sir, I wonder if you can help me. We're overbooked in economy class, and as you seem to be a suitable gentleman, I wonder if you would mind travelling first class." Would I mind? It was the first and only time I've travelled first class, and although I could never justify the expense of doing so, I was more than happy to enjoy the experience at no extra cost to myself. On the 6th of June, I left Naperville and flew to Urbana, where I preached on the Sunday and where my old friend Jim Hall was now the pastor. The next day I flew to Springfield, Missouri, to visit 2 other AOG colleges, Evangel College and Central Bible College, as well as the graduate school located in the AOG headquarters in Boonville Avenue. When I returned to Urbana on the Friday, Jim Hall had arranged an English evening where I talked about the spiritual state of the UK and taught the Americans how to make a proper cup of tea. On the Sunday morning, I preached in Normal, where that's a place where Marvin Fuchs was the pastor. I had preached for Marvin back in 72 and 74 and was delighted to see how much the church had grown since then. In the evening, I preached in Decatur, from where I flew back to Chicago, ready for my return to England the next day. Looking back on it, I felt that the trip had been very worthwhile, not just because it raised about $5,000 for our college, but because of the opportunity it gave me to visit and learn from other AOG colleges and expand my vision for Mattersey. I was very grateful to Richard Dortch for making it possible. A year later, I met Dortch in Portugal at the opening of the new chapel in the Bible College in Fanois near Lisbon, and he shared with me that he was soon likely to become the executive vice president at PTL, the centre of Jimmy and Tammy Baker's ministry, and he invited me to preach for a week on their TV station. This took place in 1985, and during our stay, Eileen, Jonathan and I were treated to the luxurious accommodation of the Heritage Grand Hotel. And we came home with a significant sum of money for our building fund. We were, of course, very grateful for their hospitality and generosity, but I confess I was not really comfortable about so much luxury. Coming to terms with the cultural differences and levels of poverty or prosperity we see around the world is by no means easy. The riches of America were in stark contrast with the poverty I was to see in India less than a year later. But I'll be telling you about that next time. Till then, the Lord bless you.